Over the last couple of weeks, we're going to complete a message this morning, and I'm going to be honest with you, I may get a little lengthy this morning, not on for the fact of just trying to, be talking just for the sake of talking, but anytime that we're in a series of messages, I always have to take at least the first few moments of the service to kind of give you a good idea of where we've been, and that's as a courtesy to those that are visiting, as well as to those that might have missed a certain part of this message up to this point, or as a point of review for those that are here on a regular basis. And so I want to do that this morning, but yet I really believe that we need to get this message out, but not at the sake of, just blowing past it and you not obtaining or, gaining the truths in this message. But I really believe that today we'll be finishing up the third part of the series entitled, How to Face Incredible Odds. How to face incredible odds. Now in 2 Chronicles 20, just get there, we're going to be dissecting several verses in that particular passage of Scripture. But I want to look at today, in 2 Chronicles 20, one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament, and it's all about how to face incredible odds. Now the Bible tells us in Hebrews chapter 6 and verse number 12, it says, through faith and patience we inherit the promises of the Father. But before that it says, be followers of those. In other words, everything in this book right here was written as an example to us, for us to be able to glean from things that we might be encountering or facing in our time that we're living in now. And I'll let you know, no matter what you're going through, no matter how big it may be or just, how insurmountable it may look through your natural eyes, let me tell you something. Somebody before you has gone through this. And the Bible gives you the promise that He will bring you through those situations. In fact, He goes on, He says He'll be able to provide a way of escape to where you can even be able to bear up against it. So how to face incredible odds, 2 Chronicles chapter number 20, and all of us in this room have felt like we've been up against it at one point or another in our lives. If you ever felt like odds were stacked against you, then this is a good message for you. And if you recall from last week, the background of this story, in order to be able to get where we're going this morning, is that there were three enemies of the nation of Israel that were setting themselves against them to destroy them. They all decided to get together. They all decided to gang up on this little nation called Israel. And out of this story, out of this passage, we're going to be able to glean some principles on how to face incredible odds. Now go to 2 Chronicles chapter number 20. If you don't have your Bibles, you will be able to provide that for you on the screen. We're going to be reading from a couple of translations this morning, the New King James Version as well as the New International Version. Both of them, keep the same flow going in the particular story here, but there's some wording that I believe that we need to pull out of each translation that will cause you to be able to go with the flow here. Now in 2 Chronicles chapter number 20, verse number 1, it says this. It happened after this. And I want you to highlight those two words, after this, because we're going to come back and look at that in just a second. It happened after this that the people of Moab, with the people of Ammon, and others with them besides the Ammonites, came to battle against Jehoshaphat. Now, when you read this, and if you can kind of picture this in your mind, this is big trouble here because this is what we would call a triple threat. This is not just one nation coming against another nation. This was three different enemies, three nations coming all together to gang up on this one small nation, Israel. In other words, there's 3-to-1 odds, and there's overwhelming odds that they had to have a miracle in this situation in order to come out victorious. Now, before we get into the meat of it, I want you to go back and look at those first couple of words that I told you to pay attention to there in 2 Chronicles chapter 20 and verse number 1. It says, it happened, everybody say, after this. Now, what is after this? Anytime I read that, I'm going, what is after this? Now, if you know anything about how the Bible was penned, it was penned in letter form. They were not chapters and verses. Those were added later for your and my convenience to be able to go to them more quickly and have it readily accessible to us. But it's written in story form. So when you understand that, if you understand what it says, it happened after this, we find out what he's talking about if you understand what took place in the previous chapter. Because in the previous chapter, you'll see that they've just now experienced what we would call an enormous spiritual revival. Things are happening. Things are just like God showing up, God showing off. It's amazing. But then all of a sudden, after this, after what? After this spiritual outpouring, after this revival, all of a sudden now these three enemies are coming against Israel. And that is just a fact of life, that anytime that you have a spiritual high in your life, or you're on a mountaintop, the next stop, you can almost guarantee, is going to be the valley. But the valley, we're going to find out in the story, is not always a bad place. For you need to understand that whenever God is at work, the devil is at work. In fact, it says, after all these great things that happen, the enemy launches his attack. Now let's see how Jehoshaphat responds to insurmountable odds. 3-1 odds. 3 nations that are hightailing it to be able to destroy them. Notice Jehoshaphat's initial reaction. Look at verses 2 and 3 of 2 Chronicles 20. It says, then some came and told Jehoshaphat, saying, now notice what he says, a great multitude. In other words, he's putting emphasis here. There's not going to be a small attack. There's not going to be an easy thing. There's not some, panty-waisted type, attack that's coming against us. It's a great multitude. It says a great multitude is coming against you from beyond the sea, from Syria, and they are in Hazazon Tamar, which is in Gedi. Then look at verse number 3. As a result of hearing this, and this is not good news, a great multitude is coming against you. They're coming to take you down. And look at Jehoshaphat's initial reaction. Verse number 3 says, and Jehoshaphat feared. Everybody say feared. Jehoshaphat's initial reaction was one of fear. In other words, he was afraid. He was afraid because he heard, he knew the reputation of these armies. He knew that he was basically next in line to be destroyed. And when you know that there's this vast army, more so than what you have in your little camp here, coming against you, it is natural to produce fear in your life. And that's what happened with him. He was afraid. And fear is the typical reaction when you face a crisis. But here's the deal. When things are falling apart, when people are ganging up against you, when everything seems to be conspiring against you, your natural response may be fear. And fear as a first reaction is perfectly normal. It's perfectly natural. It's human and it's okay. But here's the key. If fear grips your heart, don't stay there. It's okay to have your initial response being one of fear. He expressed that. He was afraid. But if fear begins to come against you and begins to manifest initially in you, that's your first response. The key is, man, it's okay if that happens. Just don't stay there. Because the issue is what you do with fear after it comes. Now, Jehoshaphat here and the children of Israel took 7 positive steps. That's what we want to look at this morning. When they heard that these 3 enemies were coming against them. Now I'm going to rush through probably the first 4 here because we've already covered it in detail. But I'm going to give it enough meat to where if you weren't here, you can be able to grasp these steps because you need to understand these things and knowing how to overcome incredible odds. The very first step that they did was they tuned into God. Everybody say tune into God. 2 Chronicles chapter number 20, verses number 3 and 4, it says this. And Jehoshaphat feared, remember, okay, that's in the initial reaction, natural response, but don't stay there. Look what happens after fear gripped his heart. It says, and Jehoshaphat feared and set himself. In other words, he had to tune into God. He set himself to seek the Lord, and then look what it says. And he proclaimed a fast throughout all of Judah, so Judah gathered together to ask help from the Lord, and from all the cities of Judah they came to seek the Lord. So the very first thing is, when you're facing incredible odds, is to tune into God. In other words, they sought the Lord first. Not after they sought counsel from everybody else. They sought the Lord first. And the question that I want to ask you this morning, if you're facing incredible odds, and if you aren't, let me tell you something, one day you will. But the question I want to present to you this morning is this. If you're facing those incredible odds, are you tuned into God? The very first thing, everybody say first thing. The very first thing that you need to do when you face a major problem is to get still and tune into God. Then the second thing is, once you begin to understand, I need to position myself. Notice what he said earlier there. He said, all of a sudden, Jehoshaphat set himself to seek the Lord. After you set yourself, put yourself in position. Once you tune into God, step number 2 is just a natural. It's time to pray. But not just any kind of prayer. We're going to see the way to pray from this model and this example that God gave us through the life of Jehoshaphat when he was facing these incredible odds. Step number 2 is to pray. Everybody say pray. Step number 1 is tune into God. Step number 2 is to pray. And I want you to take note at how Jehoshaphat prayed.